What is the most depressing place on Earth? It's highly subjective, of course, but today's destination has been frequently referenced as such by generalist and environmentalist publications. The location does feature several elements which would make it the perfect backdrop to concept album from some doom metal or black metal bands. An almost perennial frost covering the land, temperatures so low as to freeze one's will to live, the endless nights casting industrial complexes into weeks-long darkness and unnaturally coloured snow, red or black, falling upon a decaying natural landscape. Well, this place, never going there. Also because it's in Russia and I'd probably get killed. One factor prevails above all: a pervasive pollution poisoning the waters, soil, and air of this land. A steady environmental disaster which can be ascribed to one single employer. It is thanks to this factor that the media, environmental agencies, government authorities, and even said single employer have bestowed upon this city a more verifiable and objective claim, that of it being the most polluted city in the Arctic Circle. Welcome to Norilsk, Russia's frozen pollution capital. And I mean, fortunately, you're not there. You're at home, which is nice for you. Unless you're in Norilsk, in which case, sorry. Norilsk is a city of some 176,000 inhabitants, located in the Krasnoyarsk Federal Subject, itself part of the Siberian Federal District in Russia. But if you really must memorize some geographical facts about Norilsk, focus on these. It's located 300 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle, making it the world's northernmost city with a permanent population of more than 100,000 people. If you keep traveling north from here, it's gonna get real lonely real fast. Unsurprisingly, Norilsk's winters are endless, dark, cold, and brutal. From December to mid-January, the sun takes an extended break, plunging the region into almost perpetual darkness. Around the same period, average temperatures hover around minus 30 Celsius, which is about the same in Fahrenheit, which is rather toasty compared to what the lowest ever recorded temperature of minus 53 Celsius was. The cold period during the year can extend for as long as 280 days, of which almost half can be made even more miserable by persistent snowstorms. Snow and ice also contribute to Norilsk's isolation. The city is not serviced by a road network, meaning that it can be accessed only by plane or by ferries crossing the river Yenisei. This means that during the winter months, boats cannot cross the frozen river, and planes may have a hard time braving the storms. Alright, so we've established that Norilsk might not make for an ideal holiday destination because it's isolated, it's really cold, and it sounds just a bit shitty. But the city does sit on a literal treasure trove of precious metals, massive deposits of nickel, copper, platinum, and palladium, among other ores, which have pretty much sealed its destiny as one of Russia's largest industrial and metallurgic centers, and not a holiday destination. For much of its history, Norilsk was surrounded by mining operations and smelting facilities, a nickel factory to the south, a copper plant to the north, as well as iron and steel works to the east. These factories now operate under a single company, Nornickel, previously known as Norilsk Nickel. This metallurgical giant has been responsible for producing up to 85% of Russia's nickel and cobalt, 70% of its copper, and more than 95% of its platinum, which is incredible feat from one city of 176,000 people. But the company lays claim to another, rather more grim achievement. Concentrating such an amount of heavy industry operations around the same city is gonna have some rather noticeable negative effects on the quality of the air, the natural environment, and the health of the citizens. To put it simply, according to environmentalist organizations, to the Russian government, and to Nornickel themselves, Norilsk is one of the most polluted places on Earth. Nornickel are like, yeah, we're proud of that shit. Actually, this is the most polluted place in the Arctic Circle. Endless nights, isolation, a climate so cold it can freeze your soul, if you had a soul, and massive factories poisoning the air, land, and water. These elements in themselves do contribute to Norilsk's reputation as one of the most depressing places on the planet. But if that is not enough for you, let's consider the city's dark and violent history. This region has been sparsely inhabited until the early 1910s, when a geological expedition first discovered rich deposits of nickel, copper, and cobalt near the Putorana mountain range east of Norilsk. The exploitation of these mines started in earnest all the way back in 1935 when Soviet authorities under dictator Joseph Stalin solved the issue of labor with their signature solution, futuristic robots. No, it's just thousands of prisoners, just thousands of slaves. It was the Gulag system, everybody. From 1935 to 1955, about 500,000 regular criminals and political prisoners labored at the foot of the Putorana Mountains in the Norilsk camps, collectively known as Norilsk. The Gulag slaves were first forced to extract the precious ore, especially nickel, for the arms industry. Then they set out to build the company which would later become the first kernel of the city, the Norilsk Mining and Metallurgical Combine. In 1938, the Combine conducted its first tests in experimental metallurgy, and in February 1942, the camp's prisoners first started the large-scale production of nickel, sorely needed to build armor for the tanks fighting the Axis west of Moscow. Later analysis of tree ring samples have shown how the surrounding taiga, a once pristine environment of conifer woodland, was first impacted by massive emissions of sulfur dioxide exactly in that period. Now, we'll return to sulfur dioxide, or SO2, at a later stage in today's video, but if you're not at all familiar, all you need to know for the moment is that the stuff is really, really nasty. It's responsible for acid rains and widespread respiratory diseases. By early 1950s, the Norilsk labor force numbered some 30,000 individuals. They still wasted away in the mines, but were also employed in laying roads and railroads or in construction projects. Regular daily shifts lasted 12 hours. 12 grueling hours endured with a meager diet and blood-freezing temperatures, frequently plummeting to 50 degrees below Celsius, which I don't know what it is in Fahrenheit, but it's really cold. While precise figures are not available, thousands have been estimated to have died in the process. On March the 5th, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. Great news, right? Well, the Norilsk prisoners thought so, and they expected the death of the tyrant would bring about an amnesty. And it did, but just for regular criminals, not political ones. Disappointment and frustration built up until May the 26th, 1953, when a guard at Norilsk's Camp No. 5 shot and killed 2 prisoners. Their companions signaled the events by using an ingenious system of flags, and the news was picked up by Yevgeny Gritsyak, detained at Camp No. 4. Gritsyak took a bold initiative, shutting down the industrial machinery and initiating a strike. The uprising of Norilsk Gulag was on. Authorities demanded that all 5,000 prisoners at Camp No. 4 return to work. But they held fast, even when guards withheld food and water. By June the 5th, the revolt had spread to 5 more camps, involving more than 16,000 prisoners. The former forced laborers had taken control of the barracks, forming self-governing committees. A prisoner called Nikolaichuk was elected as the leader for Camp No. 3, and with good reason. The guy had devised a brilliant plan to build a rough-and-ready printing press with his work tools, which he then used to produce hundreds of leaflets publicizing the revolt. Next, he had his companions assemble dozens of kites, which they used to scatter the leaflets over Norilsk. Until then, security services had kept the Gulag uprising a secret, but thanks to Nikolaichuk and his plan, the cat was out of the bag. Central authorities reacted immediately, sending Colonel Kuznetsov from Moscow to discuss the prisoners' demands. And the demands were actually pretty reasonable given the circumstances. Their main request was to put an end to summary executions. Please, no more random killing of us. The reduction of shifts from 12 to 8 hours, and the right to write letters to their families. The colonel promised that some demands would be met immediately while others would be reviewed by Moscow. But at the same time, Kuznetsov had some ringleaders arrested, prompting a second wave of strikes in July. On the 7th of that month, prison guards surrounded Camp No. 6, the female prisoners' compound, and aimed their machine guns against the striking inmates. In response, the prisoners started digging their own graves, as if to say, "You can shoot us for all we care." The guards did not fire their weapons, but did storm the compound using water jets and truncheons. The prisoners managed to stage a mass breakout, escaping into the tundra, but were promptly arrested by troops of the MVD, the agency later known as the KGB. The arrival of the MVD put a violent end to the story of the Norilsk uprising and its fearless fighters. By August the 4th, the rebellious prisoners had surrendered to the MVD troops after losing as many as 150 casualties to rifle and machine gun fire. Despite this bloody repression, the inmates at Norilsk considered their uprising a victorious one, as Moscow granted their main demands. Shifts were reduced to 8 hours, families were allowed to send letters and care packages, and even metal bars were removed from the barracks' windows. Which is nice. The Norilsk camps would be closed shortly thereafter at the end of 1956 as part of Nikita Khrushchev's plans to at least partially dismantle Stalin's terror machine. Now, despite the closure of the compounds, mining and smelting operations absolutely boomed in the ensuing decade, and the effects would soon be felt, leaving a permanent scar on the environment. In 1960, geologists discovered 2 additional deposits of copper-nickel ores, which prompted Moscow to invest in further mining, refining, and smelting facilities. A recent bit of research conducted by the Siberian Federal University and the University of Cambridge found this period of increased activity coincided with a massive die-out of trees in the surrounding woodlands. Before the new deposits were discovered, forests experienced a 5% death rate amongst their tree population. After this, the rate was as high as 30%, depending on the site. To quote Professor Ulf Buntgen at Cambridge's Department of Geography, we can see that the trees near Norilsk started to die off massively in the 1960s due to rising pollution levels. Since atmospheric pollution in the Arctic accumulates due to large-scale circulation patterns, we expanded our study far beyond the direct effects of Norilsk's industrial sector and found that trees across the high northern latitudes are suffering as well. End quote. This pattern of mining, metal production, and continuous environmental pollution continued for decades, ravaging the local flora. By the early 1980s, all larch trees within a radius of 40 miles from Norilsk were dead, but extraction and smelting of valuable metals continued unperturbed even after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Norilsk Mining and Metallurgical Combine first became the Norilsk Nickel State Concern for the production of precious and non-ferrous metals, and in 1994 it was privatized as the Russian joint stock company Norilsk Nickel, later simply known as Nornickel. By 2014, the company and its owner and chairman, Vladimir Potanin, could boast some impressive results. Norilsk Nickel was responsible for the production of 44% of the world's palladium, 14% of all platinum, 13% of nickel, and 2% of copper globally. While as a consumer, you would not pop onto Amazon to buy some ingots of nickel, all of these metals are vital for manufacturing companies worldwide and are used in the production of phones, car parts, and white goods. In more recent times, the company features electric vehicle manufacturers among their top clients, as they are after a speciality of the house, high-purity Class 1 nickel essential for batteries. That fact, taken in isolation, might indicate that the plants at Norilsk are a positive force for the environment, as they contribute to the diffusion of electric cars and thus to the reduction of carbon emissions. But as we already know, the factories operated by Nornickel were, and are, also responsible for polluting the environment at catastrophic levels. So much so that, as early as 2010, Russian President Vladimir Putin first threatened a, quote, significant increase in environmental fines if the Norilsk plants failed to reduce emissions and modernize. We should mention at this point that the owner, Vladimir Potanin, was considered by the US Department of Treasury as an oligarch closely associated with Putin. He privatized a firm in 1994. No sh**. But it also appears that the two have had their disagreements over recent years, with the management of Nornickel being one point of contention. Mr. Potanin eventually yielded to governmental pressure and in 2013 announced his plan of environmental measures, which included the gradual closure of the nickel factory. The plants eventually would close in June 2016, but other facilities, such as the one dedicated to copper, remained in operation. Now, this 2013 plan did not achieve much in terms of reducing the release of poisonous substances into the environment. Over the past 10 years, the Nornickel concern has been responsible for mainly 2 types of pollution: release of noxious gases into the atmosphere and toxic spills into the local rivers. Brilliant. Really ruining it all, aren't you guys? According to the Ministry of Ecology and Environmental Management of Krasnoyarsk Krai in 2015, the company emitted almost 1.9 million metric tons of polluting gases. That's a weight equivalent to 75 Statues of Liberty. Up to 98% of that venomous cloud was composed of sulfur dioxide, or SO2. By comparison, take the SO2 emissions recorded in 2015 for the entirety of the US, and the number was 3.2 million metric tons. In other words, the sulfur dioxide pollution spewed by one single company in Siberia equated to 58% of SO2 emissions in the whole of the world's largest economy. As mentioned earlier, this gas is bad news as it can persist in the atmosphere for several days and lead to the formation of sulfur compounds. These, in turn, can be highly harmful to both animal and human health, leading to high prevalence of respiratory diseases. High concentrations of SO2 may cause acid rain or acid precipitations in general, which degrade or downright destroy local flora. In 2018, Krasnoyarsk Ministry reported a slight improvement, with the Norilsk complex having released only 1.8 million tons. Environmental non-profit Blacksmith Institute, now known as Pure Earth, estimated that the SO2 emitted by the metal company had turned an area of 24,000 square kilometers of once luscious taiga into the most polluted area in the world. And that's an area almost as big as Belgium, by the way, or Hawaii if you're feeling particularly American. Around the same period, a NASA observation project showed how no human-made enterprise in the whole world generated as much SO2 as the Norilsk Gulag plants. Researchers concluded that, quote, the only entities on Earth that rival its sulfur emissions are erupting volcanoes. Sulfur emissions experienced another slight decrease in 2022 when Russia's Environmental Protection Agency, the Federal Service for the Supervision of Natural Resources, reported atmospheric levels at 1.6 million metric tons. Curiously, in the same year, Norilsk themselves self-reported a slightly higher tonnage of 1.61 million, which is weirdly honest. The plumes of acid gases drifting above the frozen landscape of Norilsk have been an ominous, almost constant presence. Over time, they've become part of the background, an accepted factor in Norilsk's toxic ecosystem. As such, atmospheric pollution may not make for interesting news. The city and its largest employer, Norilsk, are more likely to be mentioned in international press when some large-scale accident takes place, one that visibly changes the geographical features and attracts the attention of the authorities. On September 5, 2016, one such event took place when the waters of the Darkhan River flowing through Norilsk suddenly turned a deep hue of red. When your rivers turn red, that's a bad sign. Officials at the Krasnoyarsk Krai's Ministry of Ecology immediately suspected that the incident had been the result of a leak of chemical pollutants originating at one of Norilsk's plants. On September 7th, company spokespeople denied such allegations and published photos of the Darkhan, which appeared unpolluted. But as the story gained traction in the press and in social media, the company was forced to admit responsibility for what had happened. Their official press release stated that the discoloration of the river had been caused by a mishap during the installation of a pipeline at the Nazhizh metallurgical plant west of Norilsk city centre. Normally, before completing work on a pipeline, engineers would flush the pipes to clean them and collect the resulting waste with filtration dams. But, according to company officials, quote, on September the 5th, as a result of abnormal rains, about 50% of the monthly precipitation rate fell in one day, water overflowed through one of the dams and ended up in the Darkhan River, end quote. Norilsk further stated that the waters of the river had been temporarily contaminated with iron salts, hence the red hue. However, their statements reassured the public that these salts did not pose any danger neither to the local fauna nor to the inhabitants. Federal authorities and environmental organizations found this version of events to be less than convincing. The Federal Service for Hydrometeorology and Environmental Monitoring contradicted Norilsk's press release, claiming that September the 5th had been a dry day. Andrei Zolotkov at non-profit Bellona Environmental Foundation did not buy into the company's understatement of the effects of iron salts. Quote, to say that iron salts are not dangerous, especially in such quantities, is too much of a statement. Even ordinary harmless table salt in large quantities can cause both human illness and poisoning of flora and fauna. And the fact that the quantities were not small is evident from the color of the water in the river, end quote. Alexei Kisolyov with Greenpeace Russia, speaking to news organization AFP, reported how Norilsk controlled access to the entire area, thus preventing him and other investigators from assessing the real effects of the September spill. In any case, it appears that the repercussions of the 2016 incident paled in comparison to the much larger event of May 29, 2020. On that day, one of the power plants supplying the Norilsk complex experienced a catastrophic incident when a large diesel tank collapsed, releasing 19,000 metric tons of diesel into the ground and into the Darkhan River. The spill was equivalent to 150,000 barrels of fuel, or almost 30 million liters, which is enough to fill up 12 Olympic swimming pools. According to Russia's Deputy Emergency Minister Alexander Chepryan, quote, such an amount of liquid diesel fuel has never been spilled in the history of mankind. For sure, this was the largest fuel spill to ever take place within the Arctic Circle. Even before emergency services could be activated, it was local activists who jumped into the fray. One of them was Vasily Ryabinin, a local officer of the Federal Service for Supervision of Natural Resources, Russia's Environmental Protection Agency. Ryabinin had previously worked for Norilsk as a chemist, but had left the company after his mentor within the company died of cancer. When Vasily tried to access the power plant where the accident had occurred, he was turned away by security guards supported by police officers. Being an expert mountaineer and photographer, the undeterred environmental officer climbed a nearby height to take some shots of the contaminated Dardakan River. Ryabinin ended up filming a 45-minute video later published on YouTube, which became the first account of the disastrous spill to reach the outside world. Top officials from the Environment Protection Agency flew in from Moscow, instructing Norilsk to initiate cleanup operations. The company complied, assigning containment booms and hundreds of workers to the effort, but Ryabinin felt that it was too little too late to stop the spread of contamination further downriver. Vasily pressed his superiors for them to analyze the waters of Lake Piasino, itself connected to the Arctic Ocean. Agency officials initially claimed that this was not possible due to the lack of means of transport. Then, some days later, the agency's head reported that there were no traces of diesel in the lake, a message which was, of course, echoed by Norilsk. Vasily Ryabinin handed in his resignation as he felt his own superiors had prevented him from assessing the full extent of the natural disaster. Ryabinin's conviction would be vindicated by another federal agency, the All-Russian Research Institute of Fisheries and Oceanography. Its deputy director, Vyacheslav Bizakov, later determined that the diesel had indeed contaminated both the Dardakan and Ambana rivers, later permeating into the subsoil. From the two rivers, the toxic spill had indeed reached Lake Piasino, and even beyond that. Bizakov's researchers found evidence of diesel and heavy metal contamination in the livers and muscles of fish found in the adjacent Piasino River down to the Kara Sea, which forms part of the Arctic Ocean. Back at the end of May 2020, reports of the massive industrial accident had reached the government in Moscow, prompting the ire of Vladimir Putin. Just weeks before the president had announced a long-term strategic plan for Russia's Arctic regions, designed to boost development of resources while protecting the environment. And now he had to learn about the largest diesel spill in the Arctic from a YouTube video? In an ensuing video conference, Putin proceeded to chew some ears off of Norilsk officials. Why did the authorities find out about this only 2 days later? Are we going to learn about emergencies from social networks? We must admit that it is not easy to find recent stories in which Russia's president plays the part of the good guy, but we have to hand it to him. In this case, he had promptly identified the cause of the disaster and the responsible person. In a public address, Putin placed the blame on Norilsk's chairman, Potanin, saying, "If you had changed the storage tank on time, there would have been no environmental damage." Note the reference to the storage tank. According to Norilsk's initial version of events, a spell of unusually warm weather had caused the permafrost under their power station to thaw. Hence, the soil under the diesel storage tank had given way, causing the collapse of the structure and the subsequent spill. But media reports pointed out that back in 2015, that same storage tank had been temporarily decommissioned for repairs. According to industrial safety regulations, Norilsk should have obtained a go-ahead from the authorities before resuming its usage. But apparently in 2019, the company had filled the tank up again with diesel without notifying the competent officials. The power plant facilities came under scrutiny from yet more federal agencies. First, the Federal Service for Environmental, Technological and Nuclear Supervision found that the permafrost beneath the facility had not degraded due to warm weather. Then the Institute of Technology Development of the Fuel and Energy Complex reached the conclusion that, quote, the collapse of the storage tank was a direct consequence of years of neglecting safety regulations for high-risk industrial facilities. The incident also revealed the lack of preparedness among companies to handle the aftermath of major accidents, end quote. Given these later reports, Norilsk could not dodge responsibility. In the weeks after the spill, prosecutors arrested the power plant's director, its chief engineer, as well as Norilsk's mayor and 2 further defendants. Moreover, in February 2021, a tribunal ruled that the company was to pay a record fine of 146 billion rubles, which is about $2 billion. After the verdict, Vladimir Potanin could not but admit that, quote, we learned this lesson well, and we're sure you did. Mr. Potanin stated that his company would carry out, quote, the instructions of the president to eliminate the consequences of the accident and to restore the ecosystem. Norilsk have later maintained that their cleanup crews were able to collect more than 90% of the leaked fuel. According to specialists at the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, this would make for an extraordinary success rate. Cleanup operations for oil spills in the sea tend to achieve an average recovery rate of 10%, with 50% being considered very high. Read into that what you will. Even if they did manage to clean up their previous mess, it appeared that the Norilsk plants had not really learned their lesson well, if we're paraphrasing Potanin. In July 2021, local activist Igor Klushin notified the Ministry of Natural Resources after identifying more traces of contamination in the Dardakan River. The ministry responded by confirming his suspicions. In the first quarter of 2021, Norilsk had directly reported to the ministry that they had dumped some pretty hefty loads of metal-related pollutants into the local waterways. These discharges equated to 4 times the legal limit of cobalt, 45 times the legal limit of iron, and 100 times the legal limit of nickel. Mr. Krushin was notified by the ministry that even though Norilsk had apparently exceeded all permissible standards, actually they were legally allowed to do so. Somehow. You see, the company had been operating under a special permit granted by the Environmental Protection Agency. Yes, really. Publication Inside Climate News questioned both the company and the agency about this particular state of affairs. Norilsk spokesman commented that, quote, "Our factories operate under strict environmental restrictions and a set of established permits, which are prescribed in accordance with project documentation with an assessment of permissible impact standards." The environmental agency, they just declined to comment. Probably smart. So, to recap, the waterways and woodlands surrounding Norilsk have been repeatedly impacted by the 2021 discharges, the 2020 diesel spill, the 2016 iron salt leaks, as well as the ongoing gaseous emissions. The impact upon the landscape is evident and undeniable. The ever-present emissions of sulfur dioxide cause the stomata, or the pores on trees' leaves, to dilate too much, which results in the loss of water. Stomata is not a word I've heard since GCSE biology. Eventually, leaves become discolored and shriveled as they struggle to generate the required energy through the process of photosynthesis. As mentioned earlier, the Norilsk factories have contaminated forested areas over a surface of 24,000 square kilometers, greatly reducing the ability of these woodlands to absorb carbon emissions. It is a vicious cycle. The more sulfur dioxide destroys plant life, the less plants are able to absorb other pollutants. Those who pay the ultimate price, of course, are the locals. The ravaged environment can sustain little animal life, causing schools of fish and reindeer herds to migrate to more welcoming rivers and lands, both of which are central to the diet and lifestyle of the Naganasan people, one of the indigenous populations of the region. As per the inhabitants of Norilsk itself, they have now become accustomed to sights which most of us would describe as apocalyptic, somewhat worthy of the Book of Revelations: red or black snow falling from the sky, an unnatural blue fog descending upon the frozen lands. Beside these spectacles, the most often cited complaint by locals is how difficult it is to breathe. Which is important. Respiratory illnesses are indeed rife among the inhabitants, especially the younger ones. The incidence of ear, nose, and throat diseases among school children living near the nickel factory, now closed, was recorded as 1.5 times higher than the incidence in other districts. More recently, children living near the still operating copper plant have shown an incidence twice as high as compared to other quarters. All in all, respiratory diseases account for almost 16% of all causes of death among children. Sulfur dioxide is the chief culprit, and it has been held responsible also for premature births, pregnancy complications, cardiovascular ailments, chronic gastrointestinal diseases, as well as lung cancer. According to a 2021 paper by the Institute of Economic Forecasting of the Russian Academy of Sciences, quote, "Lung cancer mortality is 1.2 to 2.5 times higher in Norilsk than in other Russian cities, and deaths from cardiovascular disease and infectious diseases are also elevated." And the list of health concerns goes on, unfortunately. The rates of blood disorders in children are 44% higher in Norilsk compared to other Siberian kids. Nervous system conditions are 38% more common, while musculoskeletal diseases are 28% more frequent. According to the New York Post, the average life expectancy of a factory worker in Norilsk is 10 years shorter than the Russian average. We should note that this is probably an exaggeration. You see, after retirement, most locals tend to move to warmer regions of the country, and their health outcomes are captured by a different local health authority. This makes it nigh impossible to collate significant data on life expectancy. But hey, would you really blame them for moving away? So, both Russian academia and health services acknowledge that Norilsk has destroyed large swaths of woodland, displaced animal populations, and increased the likelihood of children suffering or even dying from a variety of disorders. How can the company get away with it then, especially when Putin himself appears on their case? Well, the truth is that Norilsk has been allowed to completely walk away scot-free from the damage that it caused. As mentioned earlier, the Russian judiciary slapped a $2 billion fine on them following the 2020 diesel spill, the largest penalty ever issued in the country for environmental damages. Putin explicitly asked his cabinet that the fine should be reinvested to fight pollution in the impacted area. Quote, "I ask you to ensure that this money is used primarily to improve the environmental situation in Norilsk itself and the surrounding region." End quote. Now, the payment of the penalty had a significant impact on Nornickel's balance sheet. It's $2 billion it's want to do that. As reported by Reuters, the company's 2020 net profits fell by 39% as a consequence. Nonetheless, its chairman, Potanin, pledged to spend a further $6 billion on projects to reduce emissions and to revitalize social activities in the wider region. According to their plans, sulfur dioxide emissions should be reduced by 90% by the end of 2025 compared to the 2015 levels. This would be achieved through the installation of a complex sulfuric acid neutralization facility. Nornickel's official press releases also announced the creation of a tight internal governance system, including, quote, "the setup of a risk committee, introduction of a senior vice president for sustainable development role, creation of an environmental department, and an environmental monitoring center." These new departments would be in charge of nipping environmental damage in the bud by employing satellites, drones, collection of soil samples, and real-time sensors, monitoring a total of 1,500 pipelines, storage tanks, and production facilities. Finally, the company has also invested in the creation of the Great Norilsk Expedition, bringing together 14 institutes within the Russian Academy of Sciences to research the impact of industrial activity and climate change on the wider region's ecosystem. The expedition included even an ethnogeographic branch dedicated to studying the Nagasan and other indigenous communities. All in all, following the 2020 incident, Nornickel appeared committed to cleaning up Norilsk and returning the area to its natural beauty. As declared by Vladimir Potanin, "My dream is that Norilsk will not only become a metallurgical, but also a tourist center." As of September 2025, Nornickel has not achieved its intended goal to reduce SO2 emissions by 90% by the end of the current year. In fact, according to the sustainability section of their corporate website, the deadline has shifted to 2031. The same section reports that the total tonnage of emissions for the year 2024 was 1.27 million, which is a 37% reduction compared to 2015 emissions. So, Nornickel appears to be on a good track. Although, as pointed out by non-profit Bologna, this amount of SO2 from a single industrial site is 2.5 times larger than all polluting gases emitted by all industrial complexes in the entirety of Alaska and Arctic Canada. In terms of water pollution, Nornickel reported generating 224 million cubic meters of liquid waste in 2024. This is a notable increase compared to the annual average of sewage reported by the company from 2018 to 2023 as about 170 million cubic meters. Nonetheless, corporate sources also state that 81% of all waters were recycled and reused, and claimed that, quote, "no major impact of Nornickel's operations on water bodies was identified." These figures confirm how the company has continued to operate a steady business in the early 2020s, despite sanctions imposed on Russia following the invasion of Ukraine. In fact, Nornickel has not been impacted by any direct sanction and has continued to sell its metal products to clients in the US and the EU. Only in early 2025, Vladimir Potanin announced a 37% fall in year-on-year net profits ascribed to the indirect effects of sanctions impacting other industries. Nornickel may find it harder to sell to Western clients, but the company has already announced it will redirect its sales to Asian markets. As demand for its metals may continue to soar, we can only wonder whether the company will remain true to its environmental goals. While we do hope that Nornickel emission figures will decrease significantly by 2031, it is realistic to expect that it's going to take a much longer time before Norilsk becomes a tourist center, as per Potanin's intentions, and before its waters and woodlands are restored to their once pristine glory. The future, and life in general, may indeed appear bleak in Norilsk, and you'd be excused to confirm its alleged status as one of the most depressing places on Earth, and yet the inhabitants appear to be somewhat proud of their hometown and have been able to make the most of the bleak hand of cards that they've been dealt. The locals' indomitable will to live has been captured by photographer Elena Chesnoshova in a series of images, as inspiring as they are haunting. Young people can be seen practicing their instruments in improvised studios. We don't know their favorite genre, but our guess is heavy metal, given the local economy. Other groups of music lovers more inclined to pop and dance music are the volunteering hard between Mechanica, a club and disco, which opens once a month. Just outside the city, locals make the most of Lake Dolgo. Some choose to sunbathe during the short summer, while others plunge into its icy waters during the long winters. If there's anything we can learn from the story of the Norilsk uprising, it's that the Russian people can be trusted to be adaptable and resilient. The inhabitants of Norilsk are no exception. Even if the sun may not rise for 6 weeks, even if their city's main employer may endanger their health while putting food on the table, they have proven that life can indeed go on.